Okie dokie. So this is where we left off last time. So we had just finished talking about um, soil types and how the different makeups of different kinds of soils can lend itself to different um, concentrations of chemicals and the passage of chemicals and the collection of chemicals through those different kinds of soils. Um, so we also want to think about how are the organisms in those environments interacting with those potential chemicals. Um, so the kinds of habitats that these organisms are in matter, and the way in which these organisms are exposed to chemicals are also going to matter. So your textbook, for example, starts to talk about how chemicals can be concentrated in animals, what we call bioconcentration, and they take the perspective of a fish living in obviously an aqueous environment. So if you are a fish living in an aqueous environment, you are going to be exposed potentially to chemicals as you breathe, or sorry, as you eat things, right? So chemicals that are attached to your food particles. You can accumulate toxins from food, and if your physiology as an organism um, lends itself to not metabolizing easily or quickly those chemicals, then you can actually concentrate and accumulate those particular compounds in your system. So you can be exposed through food. You can be exposed through through the breathing. So if you are a fish in an aqueous environment, obviously you're going to be breathing through those gills, and so you have all of those membranes that are directly exposed to the environment that can accumulate things there. We could ask very similar kinds of questions about maybe a terrestrial organism. So if you were a mouse in a field, we can ask these same kinds of questions and consider these same kinds of pathways, but maybe slightly differently. So there are different kinds of food that a mouse is going to eat versus a fish, different kinds of food. There are going to be different tendencies of chemicals to be attached or sorbed to those particular food particles. As fish are eating maybe other organisms or detritus, little decomposing bits, whereas a mouse might be focusing more on plants and seeds and leaves. Um, when we think about breathing, we have the fish and their gills that are mucous membranes exposed directly to the environment versus a mouse that has lungs sort of tucked away safe inside, that is going to be in contact with more aerosolized things, chemicals that have that higher pressure, vapor pressure concept or measurement that we might want to think about. So different organisms in different habitats, we don't want to treat these pathways as the same, regardless of what kind of organism they are. We want to consider each organism in each habitat uniquely. Sorry, the little Zoom screen is covering up my preview so that I know where I'm going next. So when we think about particular organisms in their particular habitat and for any given chemical, we can calculate a bioconcentration factor, it's BCF. So the BCF, the bioconcentration factor, this is a measurement that is going to tell us how easily compounds move from the environment to the organism. So we calculate this very, very directly then by measuring the chemical concentration in the environment and the chemical concentration in the organism. So org here refers to organism, ENV refers to the environment. And just like in chemistry, we've got the brackets around things to represent concentration. So we would measure how much concentration is in the environment. We would measure how much concentration of that particular chemical is in the organism, and the ratio of those two things will tell us the concentration factor. If that chemical concentration factor is less than 1, right? So if it's less than 1, and my blanks here suggest that there is an animation that is going to reveal something, but there is not. So if we have less than 1 here, that suggests that there is a lower concentration in the organism than in the environment. This could mean that for that particular chemical, it is more soluble in the environment, right? If it's a much more aqueous thing, then it might just sort of be passing through an organism very, very quickly. The concentration is staying there very long. So it's going to be more present in the environment. So if it's a small compound, polar compounds, more aqueous dissolved compounds, then we might expect to find higher concentrations of that chemical in the environment versus in the organism, because water is going to be passing through those organisms more quickly. So if it's a bioconcentration factor less than 1, it's more prevalent in the environment than it is in the organism. And it is posing, we can assume that it is posing less of a danger. Not necessarily zero danger, but less of a danger. For bioconcentration factors greater than 1, this is where we find higher concentrations in an organism versus in the environment. So that means that that compound, whatever it is, it's getting into the environment, and then it's making its final way and becoming a repository within that organism. So these might be your larger compounds, your more nonpolar compounds, your more lipophilic kinds of compounds. Especially amongst organisms that are going to have lots of fatty tissue storage type components within their physiology that they might want to draw on at some point. Like, mammals, we tend to store a lot of our excess energy or reserve energy as fatty tissue. And especially within mammals, we use a lot of those lipids to feed our young, right? Mammals have mammary glands and produce milk. That milk is high in lipids. And so for those compounds that will have a bioconcentration factor of greater than 1, that tend to be lipophilic, that tend to be nonpolar, when those organisms store it in their fatty tissues, it can get converted and can get released with other fatty liquids like milk. And so we can see that transfer of then those compounds that get concentrated in organisms to young that don't even go out into the environment. So we can see those compounds transferred through lipids. One place that we have seen something to that effect happening is back in the day when we were frequently and commonly using DDT as an insecticide. So DDT is a large compound, it's fairly nonpolar, and it was concentrating in mammalian organisms in our fatty tissue. And several studies showed that DDT was being released in breast milk. So even though infants were not going out into the environment and being exposed to DDT, they were accumulating DDT through breast milk from their parents. So these bioconcentration factors are ways in which we can begin to describe how likely an organism is to be an endpoint for particular compounds. And we tend to get more worried about things with this bioconcentration factor greater than 1. Let's see, and it's going to depend obviously on all sorts of different physiologies. So even though we can be worried about whether or not a particular compound is going to end up in an organism as an endpoint, we also want to consider the actual chemistry of some of these compounds. So different forms of compounds or metals that we might be worried about can be differently available depending on the chemistry of their environment. So one such example, well, two examples here are related to various functional groups that we can attach to compounds and the pH at which these compounds exist. And both of these examples are using metal as the particular compound of concern that we're following and seeing how functional group and or pH can affect the availability of those compounds. So here, for example, we've got mercury. Mercury is not great for organisms to be exposed to. It can cause, it's a neurotoxic metallic compound. It can interfere with neural signaling processes. If you've ever wondered why the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland was mad, it wasn't just for comic relief. The Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland was mad because of mercury exposure. So when you make a hat, especially in Victorian England, the way in which hats were made is you would get the felt, and then in order to shape the felt and then get it to stay, you would basically soak it in liquid mercury. And you would work with the liquid mercury soaked felt with your hands, your bare hands, because it's 1890 and we didn't have gloves yet. And so you would work with this mercury soaked felt to shape the hat. And so the Mad Hatter was mad because they were just swimming with mercury and their mind had gone because they had disrupted their neural pathways so much with all of the mercury that they were exposed to. So mercury is not great. It's a compound that we're concerned about in the environment. One of the places that we are concerned about mercury exposure is especially with tuna fish. So if you consume a lot of tuna, especially a lot of tuna sushi, you can be exposing yourself to a lot of mercury. And it's not just mercury. Like, we're not saying you're going to go get some tuna sushi and there's going to be perfect little silver beads of mercury coming out of your tuna. That's not what we're saying. But when mercury is entered into the aquatic environment, microorganisms can use that mercury in some of their metabolic processes. And so one of the things that we see happening with mercury in aquatic environments is that bacteria can use that mercury and convert it into methyl mercury. And they can accumulate that mercury in themselves and attach methyl groups to it. So we can have methyl mercury or monomethyl mercury or dimethyl mercury. And that mercury with various amounts of methyl groups attached to it will accumulate in those bacteria and algae, which will be eaten by zooplankton, which will be eaten by tuna. And so tuna are going to bioconcentrate. They will bioaccumulate and bioconcentrate that methyl mercury that they got from the zooplankton, that the zooplankton got from the algae and the bacteria, that the algae and bacteria got from just really existing in the environment. So if you were to just consume solid metallic mercury, it wouldn't necessarily be as bad as potentially the methyl mercury. It's the methyl groups that make it much more recognizable to our physiology. So attaching some different functional groups onto a metal makes it a little bit more bioavailable. In terms of pH, different metals have different reactivities at different pHs. If you recall, if you go back and think about what is our sort of technical definition of pH, it's the ratio of hydrogen ions. Come on, draw. There we go. The ratio of hydrogen ions to the ratio of hydroxide ions. All right, so we have all of these charged particles existing in an aqueous solution. And as we change the pH of things, we change the ratio of hydrogens to hydroxides, right? That's what pH is. Do we all agree that that's basically what pH is? Okay. So as you change the ratio of positively charged hydrogens to negatively charged hydroxides, this can affect the oxidation state of all of those transition metals, right? All of those metals that exist in the middle of the periodic table. And aluminum is one such metal that is very much affected by the pH of the environment that it exists in. And so for aluminum gets into the environment, and depending on the pH that it exists at, it can be attached to some number of hydroxide groups, and that makes it more or less bioavailable depending on the pH. So the pH affects how many hydroxide groups can attach to that aluminum in various oxidation states. And it turns out that in a slightly acidic environment, right around 6.5-ish, this is where aluminum tends to be the most bioavailable. So in this particular oxidation state of +3, aluminum can have 3 hydroxide groups, and that makes it more bioavailable. It is more recognized by animal and other organism physiology. It can react and it can be taken up and absorbed into tissues. At more neutral or basic, we don't worry about aluminum. It's not the right form. Our physiology doesn't recognize it as such. If it's more acidic, then yet a different form, different oxidation state, our bodies don't recognize it as such. But it's really in this kind of slightly acidic range, when it's got the right amount of hydroxide groups, that it happens to be particularly receptive to organism physiology. So the pH can affect how available compounds are, and functional groups that are potentially put onto it can affect how bioavailable a particular compound is. Okay. And then last but not least, when we have different compounds existing together, we can get various kinds of interactions. So 2 particular kinds of interactions that I want to make note of are synergistic and antagonistic. So synergistic, this is basically an additive type relationship. So if you have 9 parts permethrin or pyrethrin, for example, so again, this is one of those, the word just left my brain, the chrysanthemum derived ones, that group of compounds that the word has just left my brain. Those chrysanthemum derived compounds, this is one of those. So let's say you have a concentration of 9, and it gets put together with 1 part of this piperonal butoxide. So this is one of the active ingredients in lice removal shampoo like Rid. So if you are prepping to go camping, and so you're spraying things with some of these compounds to prevent ticks, and then your kids come home from school and you realize, crap, they've got lice. Well, we don't want to go camping and sleep all in a tent together and get lice haul from each other. So we're gonna do the Rid shampoo before we all go camping together. But your kids have been helping you and they've got the pyrethrin all over them as well. This could be a potentially toxic situation where just having this one extra compound, even in a ratio of 1 to 9, this can really amp up the toxicity of all of these compounds together. So the piperonal butoxide, not terribly toxic to humans on itself. Pyrethrin, mildly toxic all on its own. And now by combining them, we've amped up the toxicity of the pyrethrin. This synergistic relationship is going to make this previously not quite so toxic compound more toxic than it would have been. So synergistic relationships are going to interact together to amplify potential toxic interactions. On the other hand, antagonistic is where compounds can negate each other. They can negate each other. So one such example of an antagonistic relationship would be atropine and organophosphates. So here's one such organophosphate, Prorathion insecticide, and this is the compound atropine. Atropine is the toxic compound that makes deadly nightshades so deadly. So these are what nightshade flowers look like. They're adorable. They're really super little. This is a plant that we do have around here. You will see it all over the place. One place that I see it particularly a lot is in drive-through lanes, especially if it's a drive-through lane that has kind of like a rough fence sort of border to separate it from like other industries or businesses. The Tim Hortons that's on Military just off the 290 over in Tonawanda, their drive-through is covered with this stuff. And it's beautiful in the spring. And you've got these nice flowers going on. And it's beautiful in the fall when the leaves are turning bright red and it's got all these bright red berries all over it. It's really, really pretty. But it is terribly toxic. Do not eat these flowers. If you have a dog, don't let them eat them. If you have kids, don't let them anywhere near this stuff. Because this is where atropine comes from. This is what makes deadly nightshade just so deadly. It's also in Jimson weed, mandrake, other plants in the nightshade. So in the nightshade family, so like tomatoes and potatoes are also in the nightshade family. Those parts of the tomato and potato plant that we eat don't contain atropine, but the parts of those plants that we don't eat do contain some of that atropine. This is why you can't eat tomato greens or potato shoots, and why once your potato eyes start growing, you can't eat them anymore because they've got atropine in them. But let's say you're babysitting your niece or nephew, they're roaming around the backyard and they say, look, berries, they shove them in their mouth. You're going to rush them to the hospital. And what the hospital is going to do is the hospital is going to come up with some Prorathion to give them. And these two compounds are going to negatively interact with each other. So they will counteract each other. And similarly speaking, let's say you're spraying for bugs in your backyard and using Prorathion, and you get a nice shot of Prorathion in the mouth. You go to the hospital, they're going to give you atropine. These two things negatively interact and undo each other. So they are both the cure to each other. So Parathine is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, so it inhibits the enzyme that turns off the nerve signaling. Atropine blocks the nerve signaling. So if there's nothing to block, then it doesn't matter that this is turned off. And if you've blocked your acetylcholine, then you can sort of turn it back on by inhibiting the stuff that blocks acetylcholine. So these two things will interact and counteract each other. So antagonistic will reduce the toxicity of them together. Synergistic will increase the toxicity of them together. All right, so with that, we've now finished this lecture and we can move on to today's set of slides. That's this. All right. I know this is a particularly long chapter in the textbook, which is why I've broken it up into two and tried my best to isolate the topics that I think are important from this really long chapter. All right, so as we continue our journey through transport of substances, all right, so we've been looking at metals. How do metals interact out in the world? Do they concentrate? Do they have functional groups? Do they need a certain pH? All that stuff. But how are these metals getting there? So metals can get into the environment in a number of ways. I'll just throw everything up here because I know we're behind on time. So metals can get into the environment through a number of pathways, most directly through mining activity. So smelting is one of the processes for concentrating and refining various kinds of metals. Often when metals are mined out of the ground, they are often complexed with other functional groups into minerals that, are not the form that we want. And so we have to burn off those other functional groups, do various other chemical reactions to separate the metal that we're interested in from the mineral ore that it may be complex to. As part of that mining activity, we do have those metals then in really high concentrations, and some of it's going to escape, right? It's not going to be a perfect reclamation process. There will be waste that is very high in metal compounds that companies are going to be asked to do something with, and they may or may not do something with it in a very good manner. Companies obviously want to do the right thing, but sometimes money wins out and they try to do it cheaply, and that's when we get some issues. One other issue that comes along with metal mining activity is often a lot of acid waste. We'll see some examples of that, I believe, later on in this lecture. One of the chemical processes that's used to often separate particular metals of interest from its mineral ore is high concentrations of acid. Metal reacts very strongly in acid, and so acids are often used to separate those things. And acid waste is often generated just in the existence of a mine, as we will see an example of. Metals can also get into the environment through the burning of fossil fuels. Metals like lead and mercury are particularly notable for their for coming from the burning of fossil fuels. That gasoline prior to the 70s, there wasn't a whole lot of unleaded gasoline, right? We all now use unleaded gasoline in our cars because the amount of lead being aerosolized from the burning of leaded gasoline was causing noticeable IQ drops in humans. And it was not only was it causing IQ drops, but it was causing health problems generally. It was increasing air pollution. A lot of the nuclear research into space was being affected by just how much lead was in our atmosphere. So this was one of the reasons why we now have unleaded fuels. Coal, the burning of coal for electricity generation leads to the release of mercury. The study of the effects of mercury on aquatic life in the Finger Lakes is a major topic of research for the Finger Lakes Research Institute, run by Hobart and William Smith College. And any body of water that is adjacent to a coal-fired power plant is concerned with mercury, and other municipalities around them are also concerned with the amount of mercury. The presence of these metals can have really direct consequences on ecosystems, everything from the metals directly themselves to the acid that they are dissolved in. They can decrease the nutrient concentration and availability of nutrients in those soils for other plants. They can stunt plant growth. Here's a nice little image from a figure from a paper looking at how increasing concentrations of copper can affect plant growth. So here you've got plants grown in no copper, and here you've got plants grown in 10 milligrams per liter of copper. So you can get quite a huge effect of copper stunting plant growth. And not all organisms will be able to tolerate whatever concentration of these metals are existing in the environment equally. Some organisms are going to be more negatively affected. Some organisms will be more resilient. Just to go back to diesel fuel, because it's not just metals in the environment, but it's also, this is where you can start to cross the line from environmental toxicology into environmental health. In diesel fuel, there are a lot of metals. There's lots of metals. It's not just lead. It's mercury, selenium, cobalt, antimony, chromium. All sorts of compounds are in leaded gasoline or in diesel fuel. And we still use quite a bit of diesel fuel. All of our long-haul trucks run on diesel. So if you're shipping something from coast to coast or up and down a coast, you're using diesel fuel to do so. Trains to haul cargo across the country also run on diesel. Ships, as you sail across the Pacific or Atlantic, run on diesel. And all of these trains, trucks, and ships will often congregate in port areas. So here is the port of Oakland on the west coast of California, because the ships are coming from across the ocean, and the trains and the trucks are coming to go pick up the cargo and disperse it to where it's supposed to go. And so you end up with ships, trains, trucks, all with their diesel fuel, all in one particular location or some small concentration area. And the Port of Oakland is one such place. And so this was a study done almost 10 years ago now, looking at the concentrations of various metals in diesel pollution. So the darker the gray, the more diesel pollution. And correlating that with where who lives within the city of Oakland. So the darker the colors here, the more minorities and the more lower income that area tends to be. And so you notice that around the port and the refineries, you have lots of dark indicating air pollution, and you also have lots of darker shaded areas indicating that it's a high concentration of minorities and other low income individuals living right there next to the port. This becomes an environmental health issue because those people who are living there are going to suffer the health consequences of being exposed to higher concentrations of diesel pollution. Some of the big marquee health effects that folks can experience thanks to diesel pollution include cancer, heart and lung disease, decreased mental function, and mildly, they can get headaches, dizziness, nausea, coughing, difficulty breathing. There's often an increased rate of asthma that is associated with those individuals living next to ports, living next to other industrial activities. So we've got a sewage plant up here. When I was in grad school, I remember we were studying map making, and one of the examples that we looked at was a power plant in the middle of the Bronx that was it was a cogeneration electricity generating plant, meaning that they burn trash in order to make electricity. This is a very common way of making electricity. There's a cogeneration plant in Lockport that burns garbage in order to generate electricity. It's a great way to make sure that garbage doesn't actually have to go to a landfill, but it's still garbage that's being burned, and anything that gets thrown away is getting burned. So we often see a lot of those kind of problems similarly to diesel associated with cogeneration plants. So the metals and other toxins that affect the land, we're not just worried about wildlife, we're worried about humans too. There are lots of things that we can do to mitigate some of these effects. So in terms of aquatic derived substances, especially harmful chemicals that we are concerned about in our wastewater. We can't, it's really hard to treat wastewater for all of the chemicals that could possibly be in there, especially when we know that that wastewater is ultimately being released back to an aquatic environment where organisms could be negatively affected by those. So one of the things that it has been proposed to do with that stuff is to take the solids from the wastewater treatment and spread it on fields to let organisms that we know can handle it work on it before it gets released to the environment. So here's an image of some of that sewage sludge spreading. We'll talk about this towards the end of the semester, but there are plants that are really good at dealing with radioactive material. There are plants that are really good at dealing with large organic compounds and can convert them from something toxic into something that's less toxic and can help mediate those things. So if you spread your sludge in a field and then plant something like sunflowers, sunflowers are really good at dealing with some of these toxic compounds. So we could be doing something like that. We can be developing filters that are meant to trap some of these more airborne emissions before they come out. So here's a power plant that's got all sorts of filters on it meant to capture things like mercury, meant to capture things like lead and cobalt and arsenic before it comes out of the coal and before it goes out into the air above the lake. So you can have filters, and we can improve our filter technology to better capture those kinds of things. We can change the composition of these of the substances from where these pollutants are sourced. We saw it with gasoline, right? We switched from diesel as our primary fuel to unleaded gasoline as our primary fuel that most of our cars burn. That really reduced significantly the amount of lead in our atmosphere that we are breathing, especially in cities and other densely populated areas. So changing gasoline composition. I've got birdshot up here because, well, it's almost hunting season. If you have a family of hunters, and especially if you have turkey hunters in your family, then you are probably experienced and know about birdshot. Most shot, so when I say shot, I don't mean the verb, I mean the noun. Birdshot exists as basically little BBs packed into a big explosive cartridge. And those BBs in birdshot, duckshot, buckshot are very often comprised of lead. And the lead from spent shot is a major source of lead pollution in wildlife. So you shoot something, you shoot a duck, the duck falls in the woods, you can't find it, you give up. But maybe a vulture finds that shot duck, or maybe a bald eagle finds that shot duck and consumes it and eats the lead shot. That bird has now eaten lead shot, and they will experience lead poisoning. There are really sad videos all the time of wildlife being brought into rehab centers that are suffering from lead poisoning because they've ingested lead shot from a killed animal that the hunter couldn't find. But we can change the birdshot composition. So increasingly shot ammunition is being converted from lead to copper. Copper also isn't great to ingest, but it's far less toxic than lead is. Not too long ago, there was even a company that was exploring making birdshot out of compressed salt. So they were taking salt and they were actually putting like other herbs and seasoning into the salt, and they were packaging it with, gunpowder into shot cartridges. And their whole pitch was, you go out and you shoot a turkey and it comes back already seasoned because it's got the salt and the herbs and everything already embedded in it. Because you can't find the shot and remove it. You have to sort of just chew your way through it. Also causes a lot of unnecessary dental work when you bite into that turkey that your family member has killed, and you find some shot with your teeth and you chip a tooth. But if it was salt, it would just dissolve in the cooking process and you wouldn't chip a tooth on it. And let's see, so we can do all these things, and then we can do soil remediation. This again comes back to planting things that can help take up those toxic compounds. You can chemically treat soil to kind of chelate metals and other things out of it. One other thing you can do to help mitigate and rehabilitate is just, invent a new process for doing something. And so here's a really nice article about how MIT accidentally discovers a better way to smelt metal, a better way to refine a particular kind of metal out from its mineral ore. All right, so we kind of ran the gamut of various terrestrial habitats. And I want to turn our attention for the rest of this to specifically focusing on water. Because water is often downhill. It is often the last place that chemical compounds tend to end up. And so I feel like water deserves a little bit of special attention. And I really do want to focus on freshwater here. So we're going to really focus on freshwater. So our freshwater repositories on Earth can be found in glaciers, other ice, snow, and then of course surface freshwater, so lakes, streams, wetlands, etc. And one of the things that we're going to be thinking about in terms of compounds that could be getting into freshwater is the residence time of the water generally in that pocket. So if in a particular kind of water body it has X residence time, compounds as they circulate in that water body will have a very similar residence. How long is that compound in that particular part of the environment? So we'll be thinking about residence time in terms of what kinds of pocket of water we are considering. So when we think about freshwater, and these are our sources of freshwater, within these different portions of freshwater that exist, most of us have more direct experience with surface water, right? We've got 2 Great Lakes all around us. We've got rivers all around us. We have wetlands and ponds all around us. Most of the fresh water that we interact with is surface water. It's open available water. However, most of the fresh water on Earth is actually frozen and we don't have a good way to interact with it. Meaning that whatever contamination happens to that frozen freshwater, it's going to have a very long residence time. It's going to stay there for a very long time. So when we think about those frozen freshwater resources, we're thinking of Antarctica. We're thinking of Greenland and those continental ice sheets that exist on Greenland and on Antarctica. We're thinking of permafrost in the Arctic. We're thinking of glaciers up in mountains. And some of those snowfields in like the Sierras or the top of really high mountains that never melt. And even among snowfields that do regularly melt, we always consider the water in the frozen state first before we consider it in its freshwater. So for example, the snow that will fall this winter in the Rockies will be next summer's irrigation supply for those states that depend on the Colorado River for their water. So a much shorter residence time for that snow, for that fresh water, only a couple months as it falls, stays over the winter, and then melts and goes into the Colorado River. So we want to think about these frozen bodies of water as having the longest residence time. These things are going to stick around the longest. It's going to take the longest to circulate, especially the more frozen it gets. So your glaciers, especially your Antarctic glaciers, like imagine the continent of Antarctica. It's basically all ice. Like hundreds of thousands of years have passed since the last time Antarctica thawed. So whatever contaminants might fall with that snow onto the ice sheets of Antarctica, those contaminants are going to stay there until those ice sheets melt out in however many dozens of thousands of years that may be. Glaciers, like what's coming out, this is from Glacier Net, or no, this is from Alaska. These glaciers take a fairly long time to melt, on the order of centuries to melt. So whatever contaminants are falling up here, it's going to be a really long time until they get down here. So we have a really long residence time with our frozen water. Another pocket of fresh water that has a really long residence time is groundwater. So 12% of the world's freshwater supply is stored underground. When we think about using groundwater. What are we using groundwater for? It's mostly used for drinking water and irrigation. Where I grew up in Southern California, we had irrigation canals from the Colorado River going to farms, but all of our municipal drinking water was coming from an aquifer underneath the desert. So we had separate drinking water from our irrigation water, but we were susceptible to groundwater. And lots of places in California actually use various aquifers and groundwater for their irrigation and drinking water. And when you have, I've got here a nice picture of a cave just so that you can visually see some water underground, but this isn't really what an aquifer looks like. An aquifer is more like a very porous sponge. And right, so if you've ever bought like those dehydrated sponges and then you get them wet and they suck up the water and they expand, an aquifer is almost like doing that in reverse. So a full aquifer is very spongy, porous rock, like pumice kind of rock. And all of those little nooks and crannies of the rock are filled with water. And then to access that water, you drill a well down into that aquifer and you begin to pump up the water. Over time, as you withdraw and withdraw and withdraw more water from that aquifer, the weight of the land on top starts to compress all of those little spaces in the aquifer. And because ground is so heavy, if you could refill that underground aquifer, like if you just ran a hose and just filled it up with water from like the Colorado River or something, you would not be able to put that much water back into the aquifer because those spaces have been compressed permanently. And it's actually happening in California, that places in California it's very dramatic to say sinking, but that's the title of the article, and so that's what I use there. So it's dramatic to say it's sinking. It's not that things are like caving in. It's more that just elevation is getting noticeably lower. And places even in my hometown are a couple of feet lower than elevation than they used to be, because those aquifers are compressing. And even if water could get back in there, they would not be able to kind of re-inflate those little pockets. So if you want to read about California sinking, this is an active hyperlink you can that you can click on. So it's really hard to get water back into these aquifers, back into these these groundwater reserves. It's also really hard to get contaminants in there. But once you do get a contaminant into an aquifer, it is really hard to get it out because it's not just like a big open lake that you can throw some chelation element into or filter it in some way. It's just sort of there and you have a hard time finding it. This is one of the reasons why oil pipelines are of such concern. So there was one pipeline in particular that has received a lot of backlash over the years, and that's the Keystone XL pipeline. I do believe at this point it's been permanently squashed as a project. But what they wanted to do, so this is some networks of oil pipelines that exist in the country. And these are all a number of active and working pipelines. So all of the blue shading bits in here are aquifers. So the white, there's no aquifers, blue, there is an aquifer. So some of these pipelines are already going over aquifers. Not too much we can do about those. A lot of these pipelines have leaked. So this pipeline in particular here had a leak back in, I want to say 2016, maybe even 2017. I forget exactly, but this pipeline leaked into the Kalamazoo River. There was a portion of the Keystone that got built over here that had a leak not too long after it was completed in 2018-ish, I want to say. But the final stretch of the Keystone did not get built, and that final stretch was meant to go right through here, and it was going to clip the corner of this large aquifer called the Ogallala Aquifer. The Ogallala Aquifer supplies drinking water to 2.3 million people as of 1990. As populations have grown, it's probably a larger number now. But basically all of the people that live here, this is the extent of the Ogallala Aquifer. So all of these people here, not only all of those people, but all of the cattle that those people grow, all of the corn that those people grow, all of the wheat that those people grow, all of the sunflowers that those people grow, right? We've got Cornhusker State, we've got Kansas, famous for sunflowers and wheat. We've got Texas, Oklahoma, famous for cattle. Nebraska also grows a fair amount of cattle, right? The Omaha Steak Company. It's called the Omaha Steak Company because there's a lot of cows in Omaha, Nebraska. Right, so there's a lot of organisms that depend on this water from the Ogallala Aquifer. It is the largest aquifer in the lower 48 states. Here's a better map that better outlines it. And you can see just how deep and full of water this portion of the Ogallala Aquifer is right here through Nebraska. And this is where they wanted to build that pipeline. It was right across the biggest, deepest portion of it. And so this is one of the reasons why this pipeline was fought against for so long and fought against so vigorously. It's a bit of a relief that it finally isn't going to happen. You know, the main reason why they wanted to build this is because of there's some oil production that happens up here in Alberta, and they were having to ship that oil sort of on the opposite and adjacent side of a triangle, and they wanted to ship it along the hypotenuse, right? Because the hypotenuse is a shorter route than having to go opposite here, adjacent. Yay, trig, becoming relevant. So they wanted to take this shortcut here, and that's why they wanted to build that pipeline. Ultimately, everything sort of ends up down here in this region where it is refined into gasoline and then shipped out to other places. So that's why they wanted to build that corner of the pipeline, was just to make that a little bit of a shorter route so that they could get it to market faster. But this pipeline, I don't think is going to happen. Fingers crossed. All right, so we've got our frozen freshwater that's something like 80%. We have our groundwater, which is another 12%. So 80 plus 12, that's 92% of the freshwater, and so that leaves the remaining 8 in surface water. So surface water is the remaining 8% of our global supply of fresh water. The retention time in surface waters is comparatively quickly compared to frozen and groundwater, right? If we consider that Antarctica isn't going to melt for another 20-some thousand years, and that it takes 20-some thousand years to cycle some water through an aquifer, the months or potentially years that it might take to circulate from Lake Superior all the way out to the St. Lawrence Seaway, that's comparatively short. In terms of a retention time. So, oh, I did my math wrong apparently at some point. Regardless, surface water is a comparatively small fraction. Whatever the math may actually be, surface water is a very small amount of actual fresh water. We tend to consider freshwater in 3 different pockets: rivers, lakes, and wetlands. So rivers, these are our flowing bodies of water. They often move from one large body of water to another large body of water, like from a lake to the ocean. Lakes are the largest pool of surface freshwater. There's 100 times more freshwater in all of the lakes of the world compared to all of the rivers and streams and wetlands of the world. Wetlands are the smallest portion of freshwater, but serve really important functions, especially regarding filtering and helping to recharge those groundwater resources like those aquifers. And if you want to learn more about freshwater, I teach a whole class about it. So next fall, I'll be teaching limb knowledge. All right, everybody okay here? Okay. The last and smallest portion of freshwater is the atmosphere. Atmosphere does contain moisture, right? Like it's about to be winter. The air is going to be really cold soon, and it's going to be really painful to breathe that cold air. And what is the appliance that you bring into your bedroom to make your winter air a bit more comfortable to breathe? A humidifier. We enjoy having moisture in our air. We like having moisture in our air. We maybe don't like that moisture so much when it's hot outside, but we enjoy having moisture in our air, and it is a significant, and it is a necessary repository of fresh water. It also has the shortest retention time of all of our pockets of fresh water, around 10 days, meaning that a molecule of water will exist in our atmosphere for approximately 10 days before it is precipitated out. And so here's the diagram where I got all of my numbers that I apparently misremembered and rounded badly as I was going through those slides, but so 87.2% plus 12 gives us a remainder of about 0.8. And so in this 0.8 of surface fresh water is all of this. And so this is our lakes and reservoirs, our rivers, our wetlands, atmosphere. We can consider the moisture in organisms as a pool. Anybody here go see the movie Dune? So if you go see the movie Dune, the water that we carry in ourselves becomes a very important piece of the story. So if I would recommend reading the book before you go and see the movie. The new movies are very true to the book, but go read the book. The book is fabulous. The water that we carry in ourselves is very important. All right, so here are all the numbers where I got my math, and I just rounded badly as I was talking. So hopefully this explains that 0.8 didn't come out of nowhere. Okay. All right, so let's go back to our surface freshwater because those are the water bodies that we are most interested in. We tend to describe our surface water bodies in one of two ways. Surface water bodies tend to be considered either oligotrophic or eutrophic. So oligotrophic means low in nutrients is what it means. So trophic is a suffix that means relating to food. And the food in this case that we're talking about is nutrient compounds. And oligo is a prefix that means few or not many. You would see oligo, we can talk about in molecular biology. We can talk about an oligonucleotide, right? A short little chain of DNA or RNA, an oligonucleotide. If you go over to poli-sci, you can talk about oligarchies, where it's a small consortium of royals or other government officials that are calling the shots. So we use the prefix oligo all over the place, and generally speaking, whenever we use it to mean a few. So few nutrients or low in nutrients. Because these aquatic systems are low in nutrients, they tend to have fewer species, not necessarily fewer individuals, but just fewer species. So we have fewer species, and these water bodies that are oligotrophic have a tendency to be, at least on a geologic timescale, they tend to be pretty young, maybe only a couple thousand years old as opposed to several thousand years old. They also tend to be pretty cold, and they tend to be pretty deep. It's a general trend. It's not 100% absolute. Nothing ever is. But a trend that you can look for. Eutrophic water bodies are pretty much on the opposite end of things. They are high in nutrients. They are truly, eu means truly nutrients. So they are pretty high in nutrients. Because they are high in nutrients, they tend to be able to support more diversity of species. They also have a tendency to be older in terms of geologic timescale. They tend to be warmer, and they tend to be more shallow. You can convert from one to the other. You can make an oligotrophic body eutrophic. You can make a eutrophic body oligotrophic. It is much more easier to convert an oligotrophic to a eutrophic body. And when you do so, you are undergoing the process of eutrophication. So eutrophication is just a process that happens to water bodies as they go from few nutrients to more nutrients. It has become a negative thing because usually what we're seeing is we are seeing this process of conversion from oligotrophic to eutrophic happen faster than geology would tend to support. And we can get all sorts of negative consequences happening out of that, like algal blooms, fish kills, etc. Occasionally, you might read a paper that will refer to a body of water as mesotrophic. As meso might suggest, it should be somewhere in the middle. So if you had some body of water that was not low in nutrients, but not particularly high in nutrients either, we could call it mesotrophic. All right, and we have some really great examples of oligotrophic and eutrophic water bodies right here in our own backyard in the Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes, in case you were not aware, were formed by a melting glacier. So once upon a time, about 12,000 years ago, there was a giant ice sheet covering North America. Yes, question. Yes. Correct. It is easier to go from oligotrophic. It is easier to go this way. It is much harder to go that way. Once the nutrients are in the water body, it's hard to get them out. If that makes sense. Okay, good question. All right, so here in our own backyard, our Great Lakes are a great demonstration of this distinction between oligotrophic versus eutrophic. So back in the day, we used to have this ice sheet, the Great Laurentian ice sheet. And as this ice sheet began to melt, this is where we get the formation of our Great Lakes. So the glacier starts to melt from the bottom up. And the first lake that we get is Lake Erie. Next, we get Ontario. We finally get Michigan, then Huron, and last but not least, Superior. So Superior is the youngest of all the Great Lakes in terms of geology. Lake Erie is the oldest lake in the Great Lakes. Because Lake Erie is the oldest lake, and because it melted first, this means that when the ice sheet came down, so when ice sheets come down on land, when they extend from the poles down onto land, they were acting like bulldozers, and they bulldoze up material. And so because Lake Erie is at the bottom of that bulldozer, it got bulldozed out the least in comparison to all the others. And so Lake Erie was the shallowest of all the lakes. And it is the shallowest still of all the lakes. So it's the shallowest, it's the oldest, it's the most southern, so it's warm, and it is also the most eutrophic because it had approximately 4,000 years of existence before Superior showed up on the scene. That's 4,000 years of streams dumping nutrients into Lake Erie, of animals roaming around Lake Erie, of human settlements existing around Lake Erie, right? 4,000 years of human existence and organismal existence happening here before Superior was even a glimmer in someone's eye. So Lake Erie is our classic poster child for eutrophic lakes. Lake Erie is a eutrophic lake. On the flip side, Lake Superior, it's the deepest, it's the coldest, it's the youngest of all the Great Lakes. It's the most northern, and so it has the less amount of biological activity happening all around it. Less amount of biological activity happening all around it. And as we think about the existence of the Great Lakes in modern times, and we think about this idea of eutrophication and the possible consequences that could bring, you know, let's think about the cities that exist around Lake Erie, right? So here we are at Buffalo. What other cities exist on Lake Erie? Let's see, well, there's a major city in Ohio right about here. What's a major city in Ohio that you know exists on a lake? Their football team sucks. Cleveland? Did everybody know Cleveland and was just too shy to say Cleveland? Maybe. All right. So I'm a real geography nerd, so geography is really exciting to me. All right, so we got Buffalo, we got Cleveland. You can go a little bit down the ways, and we got Toledo. Over here, we got Detroit. There's all of the, there's like Windsor over here. Guelph is somewhere in here. You know, all of the suburbs of Toronto are kind of over here. You got Crystal Beach and all that jazz going on over here. All right, so there's lots of stuff going around. Has anyone ever driven from here to Cleveland? Or driven, maybe you go to like Cedar Point? Anyone ever driven to Cedar Point? Okay, so you're driving along here. Would you describe that drive as desolate? Are you worried about finding a gas station or somewhere to get dinner? Worried about maybe finding a hotel to stay the night if you're tired of driving? No, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people here. If you've ever driven this way over to Detroit, there's a lot of people over here. A lot of people going on all around Lake Erie. All right, let's take a look at Lake Superior. Okay, big cities on Lake Superior. That's an excellent question. Let's see, we got Sault Ste. Marie. I don't know if we call Sault Ste. Marie a large city, but that's a city that exists on Lake Superior. We got Duluth, Minnesota. I don't know if we'd consider Duluth, Minnesota a major city. It's probably the largest city on Lake Superior. Houghton, Michigan. Anybody ever heard of Houghton, Michigan? One fellow Michigander. Excellent. All right, so we got Houghton. All right, so that's on the southern US side. Canada? My Canada geography is not so great, but I don't think there's a whole lot of major cities on the Canadian side of it. So we don't have a whole lot of people. And so when we're worried about an issue like eutrophication, where do you think we're going to be more worried about it? Lake Superior or Lake Erie? Or where is it more likely to show itself? Maybe is a better way of phrasing that question. Where are we more likely to see consequences of eutrophication? Around Lake Erie, right? Because we've got all these people doing all these things, right? It's not just the people living on the lake edge, it's all of the agriculture. If you've ever driven this route, it's a lot of ag, a lot of cornfields, a lot of wheat fields going on here. And all of that drains into the lake, and all of that fertilizer that we put on all of those fields drains into the lake. So we see a lot more consequences of eutrophication around Lake Erie. So even though Lake Erie was already a eutrophic body, it can still undergo eutrophication because we can still add more nutrients to it. And just as a side piece of information, totally unrelated to anything that we're talking about here, does anyone know the trick to remembering all of the Great Lakes? Like how to remember the names of all the Great Lakes? This is one my mom taught me when I was a kid. You can make an acronym out of them, and it's HOMES, because freshwater is our home. We like freshwater. So we've got Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior, HOMES. So you can remember HOMES. HOMES spells all 5 Great Lakes. And now you will win that at Pub Trivia. See, useful life lessons. That's what we're doing. Okay. All right. So now that we have our freshwater bodies and we're starting to be aware of some of the concerns that we are going to have with freshwater bodies, we can start to talk about water pollution. And just like we wanted to talk about the ways in which land could be contaminated by things, we want to talk about the ways in which water can be contaminated by things. When we think about water contamination, we tend to break our ways in which water can become contaminated into 2 paths of contamination. We can talk about point sources, or we can talk about non-point sources. So a point source is when there is pollution coming from some specific location or structure. Think about it this way. If you can point to it and say, that's the problem right there, it is point source solution, right? The pipe is always there. Pipe is always there. The sewage plant is always there. The oil refinery is always there. They don't go anywhere. As opposed to something like non-point. So non-point is when the source of pollution is movable or generally really large. So cows are a classic example of a non-point source. Like, yes, you can point to the cow, but this cow is going to wander over here. And this cow is going to wander up here. This cow is going to wander off screen. right? The cows are going to move. They're not always going to be in the same place that you can point to them and say, do something about that. Similarly with highways, right? The highway always goes along the lake. If you've ever driven to Cleveland, there's that big turn where it turns into Cleveland right there at the lake. So yes, the highway is always there, but is it the highway itself that's doing the pollution? No, it's the cars. And the cars are moving. The cars are never always in the same spot. They're always flexible and moving. It's transient. Transient is the word I've been looking for. A golf course can be this big long stretch of thing. Like what is the thing on a golf course that you're going to point to as the control of that? So golf courses or other large parcels of land that have things going on them adjacent to water bodies are also considered non-point. We make this distinction between point and non-point because if you're thinking about how are you going to control any of these pollution sources, non-point are much harder to regulate and to do something about because they're always moving. Because this pipe is here and it's always going to be there and it's not going to go anywhere, it's really easy to write a new regulation or a law or institute some statute that specifically addresses this thing. But because this cow isn't always there, and next year that cow might not even be alive, it's really hard to write a regulation about that cow. You can write some vague laws about cows generally, but it's a really hard thing to enact because the cows are always moving. All right, so as we think about our potential contamination, we want to keep in the back of our mind that these sources of contamination can be point or non-point sources of contamination. And we want to not only worry about the body of water itself, but we want to worry about the land surrounding those water bodies. And this becomes much more of a concern with rivers than with the lakes. We can see this happening with rivers, but we see it more, we can see floodplain issues come up with lakes, but we see it much more frequently with rivers. So here we've got several different views of the Mississippi River. First of all, I want to share with you this portion of this map. This is a gorgeous map. This is only a small segment of this map, but this is work done by the USGS where they've dug down into the sediments all the way around, and they've found all of the different pathways that the Mississippi River has taken over the last like 400 years. So we always, with a river, especially as large as the Mississippi, we think of it as this immovable thing, but it's really moving all the time. It's never in the same place from, decade to decade to decade. And so it will move all over the place. So parts of the Mississippi have gone this way, parts of the Mississippi have gone over here. Excuse me. And all of these different pathways all taken together constitute the floodplain. So the floodplain of any river is the land onto which excess water will go when the river overflows its banks. So when there's too much water in the river for the river to contain, that water goes onto land. How far onto land it goes is the floodplain. And we worry about the health of our floodplains. Why do we worry about them? Because when our rivers, it's never a question of is the river going to flood? It's a question of when is the river going to flood? There's always going to be some event that causes a lot of rain, that causes the river to overflow. Happens every year, all over the place. And we worry about that because the health of the floodplain can help to reduce the amount of time that the floodplain is active. The healthier the floodplain, the more water it's able to suck up and help the river return to its normal bank status faster. If that floodplain is degraded, meaning that we've paved onto it, that we've reduced the sponginess of that floodplain, then that water will exist on that floodplain for longer and it will impact life for longer. So just as an example of this is, so here's sort of normal river status, 1991. Here's flooded status, 1993, August of both years. So non-flood year, flood year. And you can see just how far out. So here's that floodplain boundary, unflooded versus flooded. Now all of these little different pixels of color, those are all different farms and fields. in this particular portion of the Mississippi River and along a lot of the Mississippi River, we've built farms and other communities right up to the riverbanks in the floodplain. We built things in the floodplain. And so we worry about our floodplain because when the river floods, it's economically damaging. It can reduce the viability of crops. It can impact commerce, travel of goods, all sorts of other issues. Contaminants from the floodplain can wash back into the river. Contaminants in the river can wash back onto the floodplain, right? There's that whole give and take and exchange of pollutants that we now know exists. And as we build into the floodplain, we just increase that exposure. All right, so that seems like a good enough stopping point. So I'll try to remember that we're going to pick up with this slide next time. And next time, we won't even meet in here. We'll meet in the lab and we'll get our experiment going. All right, have a great day, everyone.